The wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, rattling against the wooden walls of Elias Carter's cabin. The old man sat in his worn-out armchair, staring into the crackling fire, watching the flames twist and snap like memories he wished would burn away. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, burying the world in silence. Then, cutting through the storm, a lone, mournful howl rose from the darkness. Elias stiffened. A wolf. He hadn't heard a wolf cry like that in years, not since the days when he used to hunt them. The sound wasn't a typical wolf call. It wasn't the deep, commanding howl of a pack leader marking his territory, nor was it the triumphant song of a hunter calling his kin to a fresh kill. No, this was different. It was slow, aching, filled with something that didn't belong to the wild, something almost human. Elias sat motionless, listening. The fire cast flickering shadows against the cabin walls, but his mind drifted elsewhere, to another winter, another night filled with howls. He swallowed hard and turned his gaze toward the window. Beyond the frost-covered glass, the world was nothing but a vast, merciless white, broken only by the jagged outline of trees swaying in the wind. He saw nothing, but he could feel something, a presence lingering at the edge of the storm. Another howl rang out, closer this time. Elias exhaled sharply, forcing himself to shake it off. He wasn't a fool. He knew better than to let sentimentality take root. Wolves were survivors. They didn't beg, didn't cry. Whatever was out there would either find a way to live or it wouldn't. That was the law of the wild. Still, he found himself standing, pulling his thick coat around his shoulders. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. The cold hit him like a slap to the face, sharp and unforgiving. He squinted into the storm, his breath curling in the air like ghosts of old regrets. Then, movement, a shadow among shadows, a shape lingering just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the swirling snow. It was watching him. The old hunter in him itched to grab his rifle, but something kept him still. He recognized something in the wolf's stance, a strange hesitancy, as if the creature was waiting for something. Elias narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" he muttered, his voice barely above the wind. The wolf didn't move, didn't run. Instead, it lifted its head and howled again, a sound that carried a weight Elias didn't understand, one that pressed against his chest in a way he didn't like. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and melted into the storm, swallowed by the night. Elias stood there long after the howl had faded. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died long ago. The howling returned the next night, and the night after that. By the fourth night, Elias could no longer pretend it was a passing thing. The wolf wasn't just moving through the valley, it was staying. More than that, it was calling to him. He could hear it in the way the howl lingered, stretching over the frozen landscape, carrying a sorrow that made the cold feel sharper. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't warning, it was something else, something that shouldn't have belonged to a creature of the wild. Elias tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem, tried to focus on chopping wood, setting his traps, repairing the old fishing net that hadn't seen use in weeks. But every night, the moment the world settled into silence, the sound returned. By the seventh night, the wolf had become a ghost in Elias's life, always present but never seen, haunting the edges of his mind. He found himself waiting for the first cry, almost relieved when it came. That realization unsettled him more than the wolf itself. That night he stood on the porch once more, his lantern flickering in the wind, casting long shadows across the snow. He had been watching the trees for what felt like an hour, waiting for it to appear. Then movement, a shape half hidden by the storm. Yellow eyes flickered between the trees, watching, always watching. Elias clenched his jaw. Fine. If the damn thing was going to haunt him, then he might as well face it head on. "You're not a normal wolf, are you?" he called into the night. His voice came out rough, rusted from disuse. The wolf did not answer. Instead, it sat down, just at the edge of the trees, just far enough to remain out of reach. It curled its tail around its paws, ears twitching against the wind, but it made no move to leave. Elias narrowed his eyes. There was something unnerving about the way it held itself. It didn't act like a lone survivor scavenging for food, nor did it seem like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. It was different, too still, too knowing. It wanted something. Elias sighed and rubbed a hand down his face. He felt old, too old to be standing in the cold, talking to a damn wolf like it was some lost soul. He turned back toward the cabin, but before he could step inside, he hesitated. Then, without thinking, he tossed a piece of dried meat into the snow between them. The wolf didn't move, didn't even look at the food. Instead, it tilted its head, the smallest movement, almost as if it were questioning him. Elias frowned. He'd seen plenty of wolves in his life, hungry ones, desperate ones. This one should have pounced on the offer, but it didn't. Instead, it lowered its head just slightly, eyes never leaving Elias's face, and then it turned and disappeared into the trees once more. Elias stood there for a long time, staring at the untouched food, his breath curling into the cold. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, he dreamed of things he had long buried, of another winter, of another wolf, and of a mistake that still gnawed at him like old wounds that never quite healed. Elias woke before dawn, long before the sun could claw its way over the frozen horizon. The cabin was cold, the fire having died sometime in the night. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, moving stiffly as he stoked the embers back to life. The scent of burning wood filled the small space, but it did nothing to chase away the chill settled deep in his bones, or the feeling that something had shifted. It was the silence. For the first time in a week, the wolf hadn't howled. Elias told himself it should have been a relief, should have made it easier to go back to his old routine. But instead it left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake, like something had been taken from the night rather than given back to it. The wolf had been a presence, however strange, and now its absence felt like a missing heartbeat. Still, Elias pushed the thoughts away and forced himself into the motions of the morning. He stepped outside, boots crunching against the fresh snowfall. The storm had calmed sometime in the night, leaving the world buried under a thick, unbroken layer of white. Everything looked untouched, unspoiled, except for the tracks. Elias stopped mid-step. His breath curled in the cold air as he followed the trail of prints leading from the tree line to his porch. They weren't scattered the way most wolves moved. There was no sign of hesitation, no weaving as if tracking prey. The steps were deliberate, straight, as if the wolf had come looking for something, or someone. Elias's grip tightened around the mug of coffee in his hand. That same stirring feeling rose in his chest again, the one he didn't like, the one he thought he had buried long ago. He followed the tracks with his eyes until they stopped, just before the porch steps, right where he had stood the night before. A strange tightness formed in his throat. It had been closer than ever before, and he hadn't even known. Shoving the thought aside, Elias made his way down the steps and followed the tracks into the woods. The air smelled of ice and pine, the silence so heavy it pressed against his ears. The deeper he walked, the more he expected to see signs of the wolf. More tracks, broken branches, a sign of movement. But there was nothing, not until he reached the clearing. There, beneath a gnarled skeletal tree, sat the wolf. Ghost. Elias didn't know why the name had stuck in his mind. But looking at the wolf now, silent, unmoving, staring at him with those strange yellow eyes, it fit. The wolf wasn't curled in a defensive stance. He wasn't poised to run. He was simply waiting. Elias swallowed hard. The last time he had seen a wolf wait like that, he had been a younger man, a different man, a man who had made a mistake he never forgave himself for. Ghost blinked slowly, tilting his head, and for the briefest moment, Elias had the wild, impossible thought that this wolf knew him, not as a hunter, not as a stranger, but as something else. Elias exhaled sharply and tore his gaze away. What the hell was he doing? He was standing in the middle of the woods in the dead of winter, staring down a wild animal as if he expected an answer to a question he hadn't even spoken. He needed to leave. But just as he turned back toward the cabin, the softest sound broke the silence. A whimper. Elias froze. It wasn't loud, It wasn't even pleading, but it held a weight that struck him harder than any howl ever could. A sound of loss, of something breaking. Slowly, carefully, Elias turned back around. Ghost still sat beneath the tree, but his gaze had dropped. His ears were slightly lowered now, his breath curling weakly in the frigid air. For the first time, Elias noticed the wolf's ribs beneath his thick coat of fur. He was thinner than before, and tired. Something inside Elias twisted. He didn't want to care. He didn't want to see what was in front of him, but he did, and he knew exactly what it looked like. A creature holding on to something long gone, just like him. Without another word, Elias slowly reached into his coat, pulled out a strip of dried meat, and dropped it at his feet. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't check to see if Ghost took it, but that night as he sat by the fire, listening for the familiar howl, it never came. And for the first time in years, the silence felt heavier than the cold. The next morning, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the forest, staring at the place where Ghost had sat the night before. The snow was undisturbed, save for the faint imprint where the wolf had curled into the earth, leaving only a shallow depression behind. The piece of dried meat he had left was gone, but Elias wasn't sure if Ghost had taken it or if the wind had simply buried it beneath the frost. He should have turned back, should have gone about his morning, checking his traps, chopping wood, fixing the leak in the roof before the next storm rolled in. But something held him there, something old. Elias let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his graying hair. What the hell was he doing? He had spent years cutting himself off from the past, from the world, from things he couldn't afford to care about. And yet, he wasn't stupid. He knew that wolves didn't act this way. They weren't meant to linger like this, especially not near humans. Not unless they had a reason. And Elias had a feeling this one did. He just didn't know if he was ready to face it. Shoving his hands deeper into his coat, Elias turned on his heel and made his way back to the cabin. He told himself he wouldn't think about the wolf, wouldn't listen for it when night fell. But when the howling returned, low and mournful, echoing through the trees, he found himself sitting on the porch, staring into the darkness, waiting. And this time, Ghost stepped into the firelight. He was closer than ever before, just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. His fur was thick but uneven in places, as if he had been running for too long, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. His breath curled in the cold, but he made no sound. For a long moment, the two simply stared at each other. Elias should have been wary, should have reached for his rifle, or at the very least stepped back inside. But he didn't, because there was something in those yellow eyes that didn't belong to a wild beast, something achingly familiar. And then, without warning, the past crashed over him. A different winter, a different wolf, and a mistake that still haunted him. 7 years ago. The snow had been deep that winter, deeper than Elias had ever seen before. The cold had settled into his bones, making every breath feel sharp, every movement sluggish. It had been a bad year, the worst. He had still been guiding back then, still leading hunters through the valley, though his patience had long since worn thin for the kind of men who came seeking blood for sport. Then they had found her. She had been caught in one of their traps, a she-wolf, silver gray, too proud to whimper even as the steel bit into her leg. Elias had been the first to reach her, had knelt in the snow, hands hovering above the wound. He had known the moment he saw her that she was too far gone, but that hadn't stopped him from trying. The others had laughed, had told him to put her out of her misery, but he couldn't. Instead, he had done something stupid, something he had never told another soul. He had let her go, had cut the trap open and watched as she staggered into the woods, leaving a trail of blood behind her. He had known she wouldn't last the night, but what he hadn't known, what he hadn't realized until now, was that she had a pup waiting for her, a pup that must have followed her scent back to the cabin where she had once stood, a pup that had never forgotten. Elias's breath came slow and uneven as he stared at Ghost, his fingers curling into fists. Was it possible? Could it be the same wolf? Had he come back here all these years later for something Elias had stolen from him? A low, soft whine pulled him from his thoughts. Ghost was still watching him, still waiting. Elias exhaled sharply, the weight of memory pressing down on his chest. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. Instead, he slowly reached inside his coat, pulled out another strip of dried meat, and laid it gently on the porch. Ghost didn't move, but his tail flicked once. Just a small, almost imperceptible motion. Then just as silently as he had come, he turned and disappeared into the night. Elias sat there long after the wolf was gone, staring at the empty space he had left behind. And for the first time in years, he felt the past creeping in through the cracks he had spent so long sealing shut. But this time, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to keep it out. Elias woke with a start. He hadn't meant to fall asleep on the porch, but at some point, exhaustion had overtaken him. The cold had settled into his bones, and his limbs ached as he forced himself upright. The lantern's glow had dimmed, flickering weakly against the snow-covered ground. But it wasn't the cold that had woken him. It was the silence, the absence of howling. Elias rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away the lingering stiffness. The wolf hadn't returned, at least not while he was awake. He wasn't sure if that was a relief or a disappointment. Ghost had left him restless, uneasy. He had spent years keeping his world small, shutting out anything that didn't serve survival. It was easier that way. No attachments, no risks, no weight on his conscience. But the wolf had made a crack in something he thought was sealed shut. Elias pushed himself to his feet, letting out a slow breath as he scanned the tree line. No movement, no sign of Ghost. Just the endless stretch of snow and shadows, the same as it had always been. Except now it felt different. Inside, the fire had burned low. Elias stoked the embers, adding another log before setting a pot of water to boil. The small cabin smelled of smoke and pine, familiar scents that should have been comforting. But the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the steam rising from the kettle. But his mind wasn't in the present. It was somewhere else. 7 years ago. The memory played out like a scene he had watched too many times before. The snow, the blood, the way her body had trembled as she tried to stand, even with her leg ruined by the trap. He had watched her disappear into the woods, knowing she wouldn't make it, but he had never asked what she had left behind. Had she known her pup was still out there? Had she been trying to return to him, even in those final moments? And had Elias stolen that from her? The thought was suffocating. He had never been a good man, never claimed to be. But he had told himself he wasn't a monster either, that he didn't kill without reason, that he didn't take more than he needed. But if Ghost was her pup, if he had spent years wandering, searching for something that had been ripped away from him, what did that make Elias? His grip tightened around the edge of the table. He wanted to believe that wolves didn't remember. That time erased those kinds of wounds. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some wounds never heal. Some ghosts never leave. And this one had come back to find him. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. The temperature was dropping, the early signs of another storm. Elias stared into the flames, watching as they licked hungrily at the wood. He should let it go. Let the past stay buried. But even as he told himself that, he found himself grabbing his coat. The storm was coming, and the wolf was out there. Elias didn't know why he cared, didn't know why it mattered now when it hadn't for 7 years. But the thought of that animal, alone in the cold, with hunger in his belly and grief in his bones, it was too familiar to ignore. He pulled the coat tighter around him and stepped outside, into the night. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, a howl rose up through the dark. Low, mournful. A sound Elias understood far too well. And this time, instead of turning away, he walked toward it. The wind tore through the valley, thick with snow and ice, swallowing sound and sight alike. It wasn't the worst storm Elias had seen, but it was the kind that made men disappear if they weren't careful. And yet, he kept walking. His breath curled in the frigid air as he pulled his coat tighter, the cold sinking deep into his bones. His boots crunched over the frozen ground, each step heavier than the last. But he didn't turn back. Not this time. The howling had stopped, and that silence unsettled him more than the storm. Ghost had been here. His tracks were barely visible beneath the fresh snowfall, leading into the forest, deeper into the dark. Elias followed them, knowing he was being reckless, knowing this was stupid. But he had lived with the weight of past mistakes long enough. And if there was one thing he had learned about wolves, they don't beg. They don't sit outside a man's cabin every night, howling their grief into the wind, not unless they're asking for something, not unless they're warning him. Elias forced himself forward, his gloved hands brushing against the snow-laden trees as he made his way into the deeper woods. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know where he was going, knew the land better than he knew himself. But something about this felt different, like he was walking towards something he wasn't ready to face, like the past was waiting for him. The storm thickened, the snow coming in heavy sheets now. Elias wiped the ice from his eyelashes, squinting into the dark. Then he saw it, barely visible through the storm, a shape in the snow. His pulse kicked. At first he thought it was a fallen tree, just another shadow in the endless white. But as he stepped closer, the shape sharpened, became clearer, and his breath caught. Ghost. The wolf was lying in the snow, half buried beneath it, his fur caked with frost. His sides rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths, his body unnaturally still. Elias didn't think. He just moved. He dropped to one knee, reaching out before he could stop himself. "Damn it," he muttered, brushing the snow from the wolf's fur. Ghost didn't stir, didn't fight him. That, more than anything, sent ice crawling through Elias's chest. Because wild things don't go still unless they're near the end. And this wolf had been fighting for too long. Elias pressed a gloved hand to the animal's side, feeling the weak rise and fall of his ribs beneath all that thick fur. Still breathing, but barely, his stomach clenched. A part of him had hoped Ghost wouldn't let him get this close, that he'd snap his jaws, warn Elias away. But he didn't, because he had nothing left. And for some reason, that felt like a knife to the gut. Elias hesitated, his breath coming in rough, white clouds. He knew what he had to do, knew what the right thing was. But right and easy had never been the same thing. For 7 years, he had kept himself separate from everything, from the past, from people, from the parts of himself that still gave a damn. But now, looking at this half-dead wolf lying in the snow, something cracked open inside him, something he couldn't ignore anymore. Elias exhaled sharply, then moved. Quick, decisive. He didn't think about the weight of it, the risk. He just reached down and, with more effort than he wanted to admit, he lifted Ghost into his arms. The wolf barely reacted. That alone told Elias how bad it was. He needed warmth, needed shelter, needed help. And so, for the first time in years, Elias let someone else into his world. He turned toward the cabin, the storm howling around him, the weight of the wolf heavy against his chest. And he walked through the snow, carrying the past with him. The wind battered Elias's back as he trudged through the storm, every step heavier than the last. The wolf's weight pressed against his chest, his thick fur damp with melting snow. Ghost's breathing was shallow, barely stirring against Elias's coat. Elias gritted his teeth. He had carried men before, wounded soldiers, dying friends. He knew the way a body felt when it was teetering on the edge, when the weight meant more than just flesh and bone. Ghost was dangerously close to that edge, and Elias didn't know why it mattered so damn much. But it did. The cabin came into view through the white haze, barely more than a dark outline in the storm. He forced himself forward, boots crunching over ice, heart hammering in his chest. When he reached the porch, he kicked the door open with his boot, staggering inside. Heat slammed into him. The fire was still burning low in the hearth, and the contrast between the storm's brutality and the warmth inside sent a shudder through him. He moved fast, lowering Ghost onto the thick, fur-lined rug near the fire. Snow clung to the wolf's coat, and Elias stripped off his gloves, his hands rough and calloused as he brushed the ice away. Ghost didn't react, didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't fight. And that scared Elias more than anything. The wolf had spent weeks standing outside his cabin, howling through the night, refusing to leave. He had been strong enough to survive on his own for years. And now he was too weak to move. Elias crouched beside him, pressing a palm to the animal's side, still breathing. But his body was cold. Too cold. Cursing under his breath, Elias grabbed a thick woolen blanket from his cot and wrapped it around the wolf, tucking it close. The cabin wasn't much, but it was warm, warmer than the storm outside. It would have to be enough. Elias sat back on his heels, exhaling a slow breath, watching the steady rise and fall of Ghost's ribs. He hadn't thought about the past in a long time, hadn't allowed himself to, but now, kneeling beside this half-dead wolf, memories crept in like frost along the edges of his mind. 7 years ago, he had told himself it was just an animal, that it wasn't his fault, that he had only done what was necessary. But necessity had never left him feeling this hollow before. Elias ran a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in his bones. For years he had built walls around himself, but now in the middle of a raging storm, with a dying wolf on his floor, he felt them starting to crack, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay beyond them. The storm raged through the night, rattling the windows and screaming against the cabin walls. But inside there was only silence. Elias sat by the fire, arms resting on his knees, watching the wolf. Ghost hadn't moved. His breathing was still there, shallow, uneven, but steady. Elias had seen animals in worse shape before. Some had fought their way back. Some hadn't. Elias clenched his jaw, shifting his gaze to the fire. The flames cast long shadows across the room, flickering against the rough wooden walls. He shouldn't care this much. Shouldn't feel this twisting in his gut every time the wolf's breathing hitched. But he did, and that bothered him. Elias had spent years keeping his world small. He had built this cabin with his own hands, stocked it with the barest necessities, lived day by day with no one to answer to but himself. And yet, now there was something in his home that didn't belong to him. Something that reminded him too much of a past he'd spent years trying to forget. His fingers curled around his own wrist, the old scars beneath his sleeve burning like phantom wounds. This wasn't just a wolf. He knew that now. This was a reckoning, a moment that had been waiting for him all along. And no matter how much he wanted to ignore it, there was no turning back now. Ghost stirred just before dawn. Elias caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. Just the faintest twitch of an ear, the slow shift of muscle beneath thick fur. Then, a flicker of golden eyes. Elias stilled. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ghost's gaze locked onto his, weak, groggy, but aware. Something sharp twisted in Elias's chest. He had seen that look before. Not in a wolf, in himself. The first time he had woken up in a hospital, half dead, lungs full of blood and regret. The first time he had realized he had survived something he wasn't sure he wanted to survive. Ghost didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He just watched him, and Elias didn't look away. He had spent his whole life running, but tonight, for the first time in years, he held his ground, and something in that silence shifted. Something broke. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. Then quietly, "You're not alone anymore." He wasn't sure if he was talking to Ghost or himself. The morning light filtered through the frost-lined window, casting long, golden streaks across the cabin floor. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried in a thick, untouched blanket of snow. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of burning wood and something else, something fragile. Hope. Elias had barely slept. He sat on the floor near the fire, watching Ghost breathe, watching his ribs rise and fall with slow, measured effort. The wolf had survived the night. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something Elias wasn't sure he was ready for. With a heavy sigh, he rubbed his face, his fingers brushing against the stubble on his jaw. He hadn't spoken a word since last night, since that moment in the dim firelight when he had finally admitted what he had been running from all this time. He wasn't alone anymore. And the thought terrified him. A soft sound broke the quiet, a shift, a stir. Elias looked up just in time to see Ghost's ear flick, his body tensing beneath the thick wool blanket Elias had thrown over him. A slow, unsteady breath left the wolf's muzzle, and then his eyes opened. Not the half-lidded, unfocused gaze from before. No, this time he was awake, truly awake. Elias didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Golden eyes met his, sharp and clear, filled with something raw and unreadable. The cabin was silent, save for the distant pop of the fire. Elias had expected the wolf to react, to growl, to bare his teeth, to snap out of instinct. But Ghost didn't. He just stared, and Elias stared back. The tension was thick between them, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. A fight should have come next. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, Ghost blinked, and Elias exhaled. It wasn't submission, wasn't trust, but it was something, and right now that was enough. The hours that followed were careful, deliberate. Ghost was still too weak to move much, but Elias knew he couldn't leave him like this, not if he wanted him to live. So he worked, moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency. He melted snow over the fire, letting the warmth seep into the metal pot before carefully setting it near Ghost's muzzle. The wolf's nose twitched, his nostrils flaring at the scent of water. But he didn't drink. Elias sighed, rubbing his fingers over his knuckles. He had seen animals fade away like this before, too stubborn or too broken to fight for themselves. He wouldn't let that happen. Not this time. Elias reached for a small wooden bowl, filling it with warm water before kneeling beside the wolf. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low, rough from disuse. He dipped his fingers into the water, then let a few drops fall against Ghost's dry nose. Nothing. Elias's jaw tightened. He tried again, this time pressing his fingertips gently to the wolf's muzzle, letting the warmth of the water linger. Ghost's ears flicked, then slowly, so painfully slow, his tongue flicked out, licking the moisture from Elias's fingertips. Something clenched deep in Elias's chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let it happen. Another heartbeat passed. Then Ghost's tongue flicked out again, this time lapping weakly at the water in Elias's palm. It wasn't much, but it was a step, a first, fragile step towards something neither of them understood. Elias swallowed hard. Then, without thinking, he murmured, "Good boy." And for the first time in years, the words didn't taste bitter in his mouth. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with its steady warmth. Outside, the wind had died, leaving the snow-covered landscape eerily silent. But inside, there was movement, small, fragile, but unmistakably there. Ghost twitched, a slow, cautious shift of his front paws against the wooden floor. His golden eyes were sharper now, more alert, tracking Elias's every move. He was getting stronger, but strength wasn't enough. Elias knew that better than anyone. He watched from his chair, arms folded across his chest, as Ghost tested his limbs, trying and failing to push himself upright. His muscles trembled beneath his thick coat, and after a few shaky attempts, he collapsed with a frustrated huff. Elias sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew this moment, had lived it before. 7 years ago, a cold, sterile hospital room, blinding white lights, the weight of bandages and broken bones. "Stand, soldier." But his body hadn't listened, and now, watching Ghost struggle, he felt that same helpless frustration curling in his gut. But frustration wouldn't help. Not then, not now. So Elias pushed himself up, grabbing a small strip of dried meat from his supplies. He crouched a few feet away, letting the scent drift toward Ghost. The wolf's nose twitched. Good. He was hungry. That meant he still had fight in him. Elias held the food just out of reach, voice low but steady. "You want it? Get up." Ghost's ears flattened. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, a shift, a grunt of effort. Muscles trembling, Ghost braced his paws against the floor, his back legs still too weak to do much, but his front limbs pressing against the wooden planks. Elias didn't move, didn't help. This was his fight. Ghost lifted himself, his whole body shaking from the effort. But this time, he didn't collapse. Not immediately. He held himself up, if only for a few seconds, before the exhaustion overtook him and he sank back down. But the look in his eyes, it wasn't defeat, it was determination, and that meant everything. Elias exhaled slowly. Then, without a word, he set the dried meat in front of the wolf and stood up. Ghost had earned it. That night, Elias lay awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the wolf beside the fire. He had no idea why he had spoken to him earlier, why he had given commands like a drill instructor, as if Ghost were one of his men, one of the wounded he had tried and failed to bring home. Maybe because Ghost wasn't just a wolf anymore. Maybe because this wasn't just survival. It was something else. Something Elias wasn't sure he was ready to name. Because if Ghost was fighting for his life, then Elias had no choice but to fight too. And he didn't know if he remembered how. The days passed in a slow rhythm of firelight and falling snow. Ghost's strength grew with each sunrise. At first, he only managed to lift himself onto shaky paws, legs trembling beneath his weight. Then, a few hesitant steps. Stiff, clumsy movements that left him panting with exhaustion. But he didn't give up. Neither did Elias. He didn't know why he cared so much. He had told himself 1,000 times that the wolf wasn't his responsibility. That once Ghost could walk again, he would leave, return to the wild where he belonged. But the thought sat in Elias's chest like a frozen stone. Ghost was still here, and so was Elias. And every day the silence between them grew less like an empty void and more like an understanding. One afternoon, as Elias split firewood outside, he heard it, the sound that had haunted him for weeks. A howl, not Ghost's, a different wolf, distant, echoing through the mountains like a ghost calling for something long lost. Elias stilled, the axe handle tightening in his grip. Ghost, resting near the cabin steps, lifted his head sharply, ears pricked toward the sound. His tail twitched, golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. He knew that voice. Elias could tell. Something in his posture, in the way his body tensed, made it obvious. Ghost had never been alone. Elias swallowed hard. His mind had ignored the possibility until now, had refused to ask the question. Why had Ghost been out there, half dead and alone? What had happened to his pack? Elias glanced down at him. The wolf was staring into the trees, unmoving. He had a choice. He could turn away, ignore it, tell himself it wasn't his business. But deep down, he already knew. He wasn't that man anymore, and maybe he never had been. That night, Ghost stood. For the first time since Elias had dragged him into this cabin, he pushed himself onto all four legs and held himself there, firm and steady. Elias watched, heart tight in his chest. Ghost met his gaze, and for the first time there was something different in those golden eyes. Not just survival, not just trust, a choice. And Elias wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. But it was coming, whether he wanted it or not. The wind had changed. Elias felt it in his bones long before he saw the signs. For weeks, his world had shrunk to the size of this cabin, to the weight of firewood in his hands, the crackle of burning logs, the sound of Ghost breathing in the quiet. But now the outside world was pushing in. The wolf that had howled in the distance hadn't called again, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any sound. It lingered, in the way Ghost sat at the threshold of the cabin now, ears pricked, staring into the endless white of the mountains. Waiting. Elias didn't ask what for, didn't need to, because he knew that look, had worn it once himself. 7 years ago, in a hospital bed with too many broken bones and nothing but a folded letter on his nightstand. A letter that told him the only thing left for him in the world was gone. He hadn't left the hospital for months, hadn't had anywhere to go, so he had stayed. But Ghost still had a choice, and Elias knew, deep in his chest, that the wolf was already making it. That morning, Elias woke to something unexpected. The cabin door was open, just slightly. His gut tightened, his heart hammering as he sat up, his breath fogging in the cold air. His first thought was Ghost, but when he turned, the wolf was still there, standing just inside the doorway, golden eyes locked on the snow outside. He hadn't run, not yet, but something had changed. Elias swung his legs off the cot, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. He didn't say anything, just stood, watching Ghost the way Ghost was watching the forest. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, Ghost stepped forward. Not far, just a single step over the threshold, his paws sinking into the fresh snow. Elias's stomach twisted. This was it, wasn't it? The moment he had spent weeks ignoring. He clenched his fists at his sides. He should have been relieved. Ghost had survived. He had healed. He could walk. He could run. He could leave. That was what Elias had wanted, wasn't it? For Ghost to go back to whatever life he had before. And yet, his throat felt tight. Because it wasn't that simple. Because Ghost wasn't just some wounded animal he had patched up in the woods. He was the first living thing Elias had let in. And now he was watching him slip away. Elias exhaled slowly, stepping onto the porch. Ghost didn't turn his head, but his ears flicked, acknowledging the movement. Elias looked out at the trees, at the frozen stillness of the world beyond this cabin. Then in a voice rough from disuse, he muttered, "You sure about this?" It was a stupid question. Ghost was a wolf. Of course, he was sure. But something in Elias had to ask anyway. Ghost didn't answer. Didn't move. For a long time, they just stood there, man and wolf, staring into the nothingness ahead. Then, Ghost lowered his head, a slow, deliberate motion. Not submission, not hesitation, just acknowledgement. Then he took another step forward, and another. Elias didn't stop him, didn't call him back, just watched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides as Ghost disappeared into the trees. And this time, he didn't come back. The cabin felt different, colder despite the fire still burning, quieter despite the wind still whispering through the trees. Elias had lived alone for years. He had built his life around silence, around solitude. And yet, in the absence of that one wolf, the weight of it pressed against his ribs like a slow, suffocating ache. Ghost was gone, and Elias had told himself that was a good thing. Hadn't he spent weeks waiting for this? For the wolf to heal, to leave, to go back to whatever life had been waiting for him? But the thing about lies was that they didn't sit right in your chest, and this one was digging in like a rusted knife. For the first time in months, Elias found himself staring at the door long after he had bolted it shut for the night. Listening, not for wolves, not for danger, but for Ghost, for the soft sound of paws on the snow, for the quiet huff of breath near the fire, for the golden eyes watching him from across the room. But the cabin was empty, just like it had always been. Elias gritted his teeth, raking a hand through his hair. He should be chopping wood, should be preparing for the next storm, should be doing something. Instead, he stood in place, fists clenched at his sides, trying to drown out the hollow feeling creeping into his bones. Because deep down, he knew what this was, and he hated it. Days passed. The routine remained the same. Wake up, stoke the fire, check the traps, split the wood, survive. And yet, everything felt different. Elias caught himself looking toward the tree line when he stepped outside, searching the endless white for a flash of silver fur. He listened when the wind howled, half expecting to hear an answering call. He never did. And the longer the silence stretched, the more restless something inside him became. Then on the seventh night, it happened. The first sign that something was wrong. It was late when Elias heard it. A single sharp crack from the tree line. Not wind, not the natural creaking of frozen branches. Something else. Elias's gut clenched. Instinct had him reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. He moved toward the door, pressing a hand against the wood, listening. Nothing. Then, a low, distant growl. Elias's breath hitched. It wasn't Ghost. He knew that instantly. The sound was deeper, rougher, layered with something ugly. He had spent weeks listening to a wounded wolf breathe in his cabin, had learned every nuance of Ghost's body language, his quiet grumbles, the way his growl sat at the back of his throat but never truly threatened. But this was something else, a different wolf, or maybe more than one. Elias's pulse hammered against his ribs. He tightened his grip on the rifle, moving toward the window, keeping his steps soundless. Outside, the moonlight stretched long shadows across the snow. At first, he saw nothing. Then just beyond the trees, eyes, several pairs of them, watching, waiting. His stomach turned to ice, because for the first time since dragging that half-dead wolf into his cabin, Elias understood something. Ghost hadn't just been lost. He had been running from something, and whatever it was, It had finally caught up. The wolves didn't leave. Elias spent the entire night at the window, rifle in hand, waiting for them to move. They never did. They sat at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on the cabin, bodies barely visible against the dark snow. Waiting. For what? Elias didn't know, but he could feel the tension curling through the air, thick and oppressive, like the weight of an oncoming storm. This wasn't a wandering pack. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else. And deep in his chest, Elias knew. This had everything to do with Ghost. By morning, the wolves were gone. No prints in the snow. No lingering scent. Nothing. Like they had never been there at all. But Elias knew better. He could still feel their eyes on him. Still sense the presence just beyond the tree line. Pressing against the edge of his world. Closing in. And if he had learned anything in his years alone in these mountains, it was that a wolf didn't watch for that long unless it was deciding something, hunting something, which meant they weren't done. Not yet. Elias spent the day preparing. More wood, more water, more bullets. His traps remained untouched, which meant the pack wasn't here for food. That left only two other options, territory or revenge. And Elias had a sickening feeling he already knew which one, because Ghost had arrived half dead, torn apart, barely breathing, and now the wolves had come back, which meant someone had been waiting for him to fail, for him to die, and when that hadn't happened, they had come to finish the job. That night, Elias barely slept. He sat at the table, rifle across his lap, the fire burning low, listening, waiting, and just before dawn, the howling started, low and stretched thin, a mournful sound that crawled beneath his skin. One voice, then two, then more, coming from every direction, surrounding the cabin, a slow, deliberate warning. Elias's chest tightened. They weren't just passing through. They weren't hunting deer. They were calling to something. And when the last voice faded into the night, the wind carried a final, distant sound. A howl Elias knew. Ghost. But it wasn't a call. It was something else. Something broken. Something that sounded an awful lot like a plea. The howling faded into the wind, leaving only silence. Elias sat frozen by the fire, heart hammering against his ribs. Ghost was out there, wounded, surrounded. And if Elias didn't move, if he stayed inside his cabin like he had his entire life, Ghost would die out there, alone, just like Elias had always told himself he wanted to be. But something inside him had already cracked, something that had been breaking from the moment he found that half-dead wolf in the snow. And now, sitting in the cabin, listening to the suffocating stillness, Elias realized he couldn't go back to who he was before. Not now, not after Ghost. Elias moved before he could second-guess himself. He grabbed his coat, his knife, his rifle, and shoved open the cabin door. The cold hit him like a blade, cutting through his skin. But it wasn't just the cold that made him stop. It was the tracks. Not one wolf. Many. Circling the cabin. Ghost's tracks were there too. Lighter, unsteady. He had been here. Close. But the others had driven him away, hurting him, cornering him. Elias's throat tightened. If he didn't find Ghost now, he never would. He followed the tracks through the snow, gripping his rifle tight. The night was deathly quiet. No wind, no birds, just his own breath, his own heartbeat, and the growing dread curling in his chest. Then up ahead, movement, a flicker of silver between the trees. Ghost. But he wasn't alone. 3 wolves circled him, their bodies low, ears pinned back. Ghost stood in the center, his fur bristling, one leg barely holding his weight. He was cornered, but he wasn't running, wasn't submitting. Elias clenched his jaw. The damn wolf was still fighting, even now, even when he was outnumbered, even when he should have just given up. And maybe that was what made Elias raise his rifle. Maybe that was why, after years of surviving alone, of convincing himself that nothing and no one mattered, he pulled the trigger. The shot split the night. A wolf yelped and staggered back, blood staining the snow. The others snapped their heads toward Elias, ears flattening, eyes burning. Elias didn't move, didn't waver. His rifle was steady. His choice had already been made. The pack hesitated. One wolf growled low in its throat, hackles raised. Elias cocked the rifle again, slow and deliberate, daring them. For a long, frozen second, nothing moved. Then, the wolves turned and ran. Ghost collapsed into the snow the moment they were gone. Elias was there in seconds, shoving his rifle over his shoulder, kneeling beside the wolf. His fur was slick with blood. His breath came in short, shaking gasps. "Damn it," Elias muttered, running a hand over Ghost's side, checking for wounds. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Ghost let out a weak, breathy sound, almost like a laugh. Elias swallowed hard. He didn't even realize he was shaking. Not from the cold, not from the fear, from something else. Something that felt an awful lot like relief. He exhaled sharply, then hooked his arms under the wolf and lifted him. "You're coming home." The walk back was slow. Ghost was lighter than Elias remembered, weaker, but he was alive. And this time, as Elias carried him toward the cabin, the silence didn't feel so empty. It felt right, like the sound of two survivors breathing in the same rhythm, like the sound of not being alone anymore. The cabin was waiting. Elias stepped inside, kicked the door shut, and laid Ghost by the fire. The wolf blinked up at him, golden eyes catching the light. Elias let out a rough breath, and for the first time in years, he spoke words he never thought he'd say. "You're safe. You're home." And this time, he meant it.